Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about an HOA that bans me from using my pool. I first noticed something was off the morning after I moved into my new home. Well, not entirely new. It was a 1970s ranch-style place, solidly built, with a yard just large enough that I wouldn't have to stare directly at neighbors' living rooms, but not so big that I'd lose track of my property lines. The realtor had mentioned in passing that the previous owner, a retired math teacher named Roderick, had disengaged from the local homeowners association some years before I signed the purchase agreement. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I'd been looking for a home without the long list of nitpicky rules I'd heard HOAs often bring, and I took the realtor's comment as good news. Little did I know that the local HOA representatives had other ideas. The first odd encounter happened the day after I moved in. I had barely gotten the couch positioned and was still working through boxes in the living room when I heard a quick, sharp knock on the front door. Standing outside was a woman, somewhere in her 50s, hair so tightly permed that each curl looked carved from wood. She wore a floral blouse that looked like it hadn't changed styles since the early 90s, and her expression suggested I'd done something wrong by existing. She introduced herself as Elmira, the head of the neighborhood HOA board, and asked if I had a moment to discuss some expectations. At that point, I wasn't even aware they considered me part of their community structure. I knew there was an HOA in the area, but from what the realtor told me, the previous owner had not only stopped participating, but had even managed to get a special legal arrangement removing the property from the HOA's jurisdiction. So I was caught off guard. I told Elmira politely that I didn't think my home was under their HOA. She responded with a tight smile and said she'd be in touch. Then she turned sharply on her heel and left. The whole exchange was under 3 minutes. I brushed it off at first. Maybe she was just introducing herself. But the following week, I found a letter stuck in my mailbox. It had the HOA logo, a stylized oak tree, on the envelope. Inside was a notice stating that certain amenities on my property were subject to HOA guidelines. The strangest part, they specifically mentioned the pool in my backyard. Here's what you need to know. One of the selling points of the house was the in-ground pool. It's not Olympic size, nothing extravagant, just a standard backyard pool with a small deck and a modest privacy fence. It's a nice place to lounge, especially in warm weather. I'd planned on having a small housewarming party with a few old friends and family members as soon as I got the place in order. According to this letter, though, the HOA had a temporary moratorium on private pool usage. They claimed it was related to community aesthetic standards. That phrase made no sense. Who forbids someone from using their own pool because of aesthetics? I put the letter aside, thinking there must be some confusion. The next morning, I decided to test the waters. Literally. It was a warm spring day, and I had a bit of free time before I started unpacking more boxes. So I went outside, wearing swim trunks and carrying a towel, planning to just dangle my feet in the pool. Before I even got onto the deck, I heard a cough. Elmira, once again, had somehow appeared at the edge of my backyard. She was standing just outside the fence, arms crossed, looking at me as if I'd just tried to set the house on fire. "Excuse me," she said, voice raised enough to carry. "The use of your pool is currently restricted." I stared at her, incredulous. Restricted by whom? "By the association," she replied, her tone prim and self-assured. "We have rules here about when pools can be used and by whom." This was absurd. I told her again that I wasn't under the HOA's authority. She shook her head, then pulled a folded piece of paper from her handbag and began reading off a set of conditions, none of which made sense. One was something about pool water level guidelines aligning with a communal irrigation plan. Another talked about the historic nature of the neighborhood's landscape. Never mind that the pool had been here since the mid-1980s, and no one had ever called it historic. She finished by stating that my rights to use the pool were suspended until further notice. At this point, I was more baffled than angry. I calmly told her that I had legal documentation from the previous owner indicating that this property was not part of the HOA. Elmira just pursed her lips and said, "That might have been true once, but circumstances have changed." Then she marched off before I could say another word. I spent the rest of that afternoon digging through the giant file folder my realtor had given me at closing. Eventually, I found the relevant documents. Indeed, the previous owner had gone to great lengths to separate the property from the HOA after some dispute over landscaping fees. I had a signed agreement, properly recorded, stating that the property at my address was not under the HOA's jurisdiction. It was dated 3 years prior. Satisfied, I decided to let Elmira know as much the next time she bothered me. She didn't bother me personally for a few days, but I did start noticing odd things. One morning, I saw a stranger taking pictures over my fence. Another time, I came home to a notice taped on the front door referencing a lien that the HOA planned to place on my home if I continued violating their pool usage guidelines. This was ridiculous. How could they place a lien if I wasn't even part of their group? I decided it was time to take more decisive action. I contacted a friend of mine, Marcus, who's a lawyer specializing in property law. Marcus looked over my documents and confirmed what I already knew. I was not obligated to follow HOA rules, as the property was legally exempt. He suggested sending a certified letter to the HOA board stating as much and demanding they stop harassing me. He also recommended I set up a security camera by the pool to record any trespassers or intruders, in case they tried something more direct. I followed his advice. I sent the letter and installed a camera hidden near my back fence, aimed towards the pool area. I was hoping that a formal, lawyer-drafted letter would make them back off. Instead, what I got in return was a series of escalating attempts at intimidation. First, I received a letter signed by the HOA treasurer, Graydon, stating that since I was enjoying the benefits of the neighborhood, whatever that meant, I was subject to their rules by default. Then I got a flyer slipped under my door promoting the next HOA meeting, where disciplinary actions would be discussed. At that point, I realized these people were either completely delusional or running some bizarre scheme. I decided to attend that HOA meeting, even though, by law, I didn't have to. I wanted to confront them publicly. Maybe airing everything out would finally resolve this nonsense. The meeting was held in the community center, an old converted garage next to a park. When I walked in, I recognized Elmira and Graydon at a makeshift podium. Several neighbors were seated in folding chairs, looking rather bored. The meeting started with mundane issues. Someone's fence was too tall, another person's shrubbery was apparently too wild. Then they got to the matter of unauthorized pool usage. Elmira cleared her throat and began describing my property as if it were some sort of outlaw compound. She said, certain residents were reneging on their community obligations. Graydon chimed in with talk of shared aesthetics and water resource management. The entire thing sounded like they were reading from a script designed to confuse. I waited until they opened the floor for comments, then stood up and introduced myself as the owner of the property in question. The room shifted. Some neighbors looked curious, others rolled their eyes, probably used to these theatrics. I held up a copy of the document that Marcus had prepared. I explained calmly that my property was not part of the HOA and that I had the legal right to use my pool. I even offered to show anyone interested the official documents that proved this. Elmira's face got tight. She insisted that at some point the previous owner was part of the HOA and that once in, always in. I pointed out that the previous owner had legally separated from it. Graydon tried a different angle. Even if you're not formally in the HOA, he said, you are benefiting from the neighborhood's standards. It's only fair you follow some guidelines. His logic was nonsense. No one can force me into a contract I never signed. I could see that reason wasn't going to get through to them. So I made a firm statement that if they persisted in harassing me, I'd have no choice but to take legal action. Then I left. On my way out, a neighbor, Adela, stopped me and whispered that I wasn't the first to have trouble with this HOA board. She said they often tried to bully newcomers, counting on them not knowing the rules. She urged me to stand my ground, hinting that a few other residents might be silently rooting for me because the HOA had forced them into expensive home modifications or ridiculous fines. Back home, I mulled over what to do next. Marcus recommended we file a cease and desist letter, officially, and prepare for a potential lawsuit if they didn't back down. I was reluctant to escalate, but my patience was wearing thin. Days later, I woke up to find that the lock on my pool's gate had been tampered with. It looked like someone had tried to jam something in it so I couldn't open it easily. Luckily, my camera captured footage of Elmira herself leaning over my fence late at night, fiddling with the latch. That was trespassing, and I had proof. I called the non-emergency police line. An officer came by, reviewed the footage, and agreed it was suspicious. While the officer couldn't arrest someone for just messing with a gate latch without more context, they said it would be documented, and I could seek a restraining order if it continued. Having police documentation might come in handy later. Marcus said. I decided it was time for a more strategic form of pushback. The HOA clearly felt they had authority. Maybe I could turn the tables. I drafted a letter addressed to the entire neighborhood, explaining my situation in plain language. I included how the previous owner had left the HOA entirely and how the current board was trying to enforce non-existent rules on me. I did not mention any names, just the facts. Then, over the course of a couple of nights, I placed a copy in each neighbor's mailbox. I wanted them to see the other side of the story. A day later, Adela knocked on my door with a grateful smile. She said many neighbors were talking about my letter. Some had known for a while that the HOA board's behavior was out of line, but they felt intimidated. Adela confessed that Elmira and Graydon often threatened to fine people for small infractions, and even hinted that non-compliance could reduce property values. Some residents were tired of these scare tactics, but they didn't know how to fight back. This gave me an idea. If I could prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the HOA was acting illegally, especially towards me, someone who wasn't even in their jurisdiction, maybe I could inspire others to stand up too. I consulted Marcus again, and we decided to push forward with a formal demand letter, warning them that if they continued their harassment, we'd sue for damages and attorney's fees. We sent this letter via certified mail, requiring a signature. 2 weeks passed with no direct response, but strange things were happening. One early morning, I noticed Graydon across the street, talking quietly with a man in a suit and holding a folder. They glanced my way, then moved behind a hedge as if discussing something secretive. Another afternoon, I found a pamphlet stuck to my car windshield claiming the neighborhood's HOA had a special historical charter, giving them authority over all properties up to the nearest main road, which would include mine. It was laughably amateurish, with no legal citations, just a bunch of pretentious language. Then, in what I can only describe as an act of audacious nerve, I got a letter in the mail claiming the HOA had decided to reinstate me into their roster. It announced that I now owed back dues for the 3 years since the previous owner had left. The amount was staggering, thousands of dollars, and they demanded immediate payment, or else they would initiate foreclosure proceedings. This crossed a big line. You can't just force someone into your HOA and then demand back dues. That's completely outside the bounds of any contract law. They were trying to bluff me into paying up. Marcus was livid when he saw this. He said we had more than enough evidence now to take them to court. Before filing a suit, he suggested we have a title specialist review my property deed and the old legal agreement again, just to be absolutely certain of our standing. The title specialist confirmed every detail. I was not in the HOA, never had been, and their claims were baseless. Armed with this, Marcus prepared a lawsuit alleging harassment, attempted extortion, and defamation, given that they were spreading misinformation about my obligations. But I wanted to give them one last chance to back down. Maybe I'm too nice, but I figured if I confronted them directly with irrefutable evidence, they might cave. So I arranged another appearance at the HOA monthly meeting. This time I brought copies of all the legal documents: my deed, the separation agreement, the footage of Elmira tampering with my gate, the ridiculous reinstatement letter. And I also brought Marcus along. When we entered the community center, the mood was tense. Elmira and Graydon were at the podium again, looking smug. I took the floor immediately after they finished a brief introduction. I spoke calmly and clearly. I stated my name, my address, and my property rights. I explained that I was not under their purview, that I had legally binding documents to prove it, and that I would not tolerate further harassment. I held up the reinstatement letter and read it aloud, pointing out how ludicrous and illegal it was to retroactively add me to their HOA roster without my consent. I then offered them a simple choice: cease all harassment now, and acknowledge publicly that I am not subject to their rules or face a lawsuit. Marcus chimed in with a brief statement of potential legal consequences, making sure to use language they'd understand. You will lose in court, and you will pay all my clients' fees and damages. For a moment, Elmira seemed stunned. Graydon tried to interject something about protecting the community, but a few neighbors in the audience shouted him down. One neighbor, Orvin, stood up and said he'd also been bullied by the board. Another, Tricia, mentioned she had paid unjust fines for minor landscaping violations. The atmosphere turned against the board as people began voicing complaints. I realized I wasn't just fighting for my pool anymore. I was exposing an entire pattern of abuse. Elmira tried to regain control, banging a gavel and demanding order. When things quieted down, she said something that made my jaw drop. The historical charter of our community predates the current property laws, and we have the right to enforce standards of conduct. The pool violates aesthetic harmony. She sounded like she believed it, as if some unwritten ancient code gave her divine authority. Marcus politely asked her to produce any legal documentation supporting this historical charter. Of course, she had nothing. She stuttered, then tried changing the subject. I pressed on, laying out my evidence methodically. The previous owner's legal separation from the HOA was recorded at the county office. I had that on file. The attempt to reinstate me was not only a transparent fraud, but a form of extortion. And I had video evidence of Elmira trespassing on my property. I finished by saying, "You have 1 week to issue a written retraction of all these claims and to promise not to interfere with my property rights again. If you don't, I will file the lawsuit. I will also report these actions to local law enforcement and pursue criminal charges where applicable." The room was silent. Adela and a few others nodded approvingly. Finally, Graydon spoke. "We will have to consult with our attorney." I welcomed that, knowing that no reputable attorney would support their nonsense. I left the meeting feeling a mix of relief and lingering anger. Over the next few days, I saw activity around the HOA's small office building. People coming and going, arms full of documents, looking stressed. Adela told me she heard rumors that the HOA board was in panic mode. They didn't have the funds for a drawn-out lawsuit. Their bylaws were outdated, and they'd never expected anyone to challenge them this directly. A week passed and no retraction letter arrived. Marcus and I filed the lawsuit. We claimed harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, trespass, and attempted extortion. The process server delivered the summons to the HOA's registered agent, and I waited to see what would happen next. During this waiting period, I decided to ensure my pool was well protected. I upgraded my fence, installed better locks, and added a more advanced security system. This wasn't just about a pool anymore. It was about standing my ground. The neighbors, too, became more engaged. A small group formed to review the HOA's bylaws and challenge unfair rules. Adela told me that people were banding together, sharing their own stories of wrongful fines and intimidation. About 2 weeks before the first court hearing, I received a letter from the HOA's newly hired attorney. It was a meandering piece of legalese that tried to backtrack on their previous positions. It said that the HOA had reviewed the relevant documents and now recognized that my property falls outside their jurisdiction. It claimed all previous communications were based on misunderstood historical records. There was no apology, just a vague acknowledgement that they could not enforce any rules on me. They also stated they would decline to proceed with any attempt to collect dues or restrict my property usage. Marcus and I read this letter carefully. While it addressed my case, it did not mention restitution or any admission of wrongdoing. It was just a step back to avoid the lawsuit. Marcus recommended that I settle only if they agreed to reimburse my legal fees and issue a public statement acknowledging they had no authority over my property. He drafted a reply, offering to dismiss the lawsuit if they met those conditions. As we waited for their response, the pressure on the HOA board mounted. Several neighbors, emboldened by my confrontation, had filed their own complaints with local authorities and were exploring their own legal options. According to Adela, the board members were frantically trying to save face. They knew if they went to court and lost badly, it could encourage a flood of additional lawsuits from other residents. Eventually, I got a second letter. This time, it was a formal settlement offer. They agreed to pay my legal fees, issue a written statement confirming that I was not under their rules, and include a note that the HOA board had misinterpreted their governing documents. They also promised to cease all harassment and remove any mention of my property from their records. In exchange, I would drop the lawsuit and not pursue further damages. Marcus and I considered this carefully. I wanted a bit more, an apology for the trespassing incident. After some back and forth, they agreed to add a line stating that the board regrets any inconvenience or distress caused by the previous misunderstanding. It wasn't a heartfelt apology, but it was as close as they'd get. I accepted the settlement. With that resolved, I turned my attention back to my home. The pool, once a source of unjust conflict, was now just a nice amenity again. I used it freely. I invited friends over for that housewarming party I'd postponed. We grilled burgers, lounged in the sun, and laughed about the absurdity of it all. Adela stopped by with a fruit salad and joked that maybe we should start our own Homeowners Freedom Association. In the months that followed, the HOA board faced a reckoning. One by one, board members resigned. The neighbors demanded a new election for the board positions, and more reasonable, community-oriented people stepped up to run. Their platform was transparency, fairness, and respect for property rights. Elmira and Graydon disappeared from the community spotlight. I heard rumors that Elmira might have moved out of the neighborhood altogether. Graydon stayed, but kept a very low profile. Other residents I'd barely known before thanked me for standing up to the HOA's bullying. Several told me stories about how they had been forced to repaint their front doors 3 times because the board kept changing the approved color scheme, or how they were fined for having a small garden statue that the board deemed not harmonious. Now that the board had been replaced and the rules were being reviewed, those petty restrictions were relaxed or eliminated. My case had set a precedent. The neighborhood learned that not only were these outdated and overreaching HOA rules unenforceable against someone who wasn't even a member, but that they also needed to re-examine the scope of their authority over actual members. The new board promised to abide by state laws and respect homeowners' individual property rights. They even invited suggestions from residents on how to improve the community center and common areas without imposing ridiculous standards. Personally, I felt a sense of relief and pride. I hadn't wanted a fight, but I refused to be bullied. By standing up for myself, I'd helped prompt a positive change in the neighborhood. My house and my pool were my private property, and that simple fact had finally been acknowledged by everyone. The settlement check arrived shortly after, covering all of Marcus's fees and even leaving a little bit extra, which I used to upgrade my landscaping. Now I had a lush backyard with blooming flowers, some ornamental shrubs, and a perfectly maintained pool. I never got a direct apology from Elmira or Graydon, but I didn't need one. Their silence and withdrawal was enough. The neighbors understood what had happened, and no one questioned my right to enjoy my pool anymore. In fact, some neighbors asked if they could come by for a swim now and then. I was happy to oblige, as long as they respected my property and brought their own towels. To my surprise, this whole ordeal had a silver lining. I got to know several neighbors better. Adela and her partner invited me over for dinner. Orvin and I bonded over our shared love of old Western movies. Tricia and I started trading gardening tips. The fear of the old board had melted away, replaced by a more genuine sense of community. I discovered that the neighborhood, which had once seemed controlled by a small group of power-hungry individuals, was actually full of kind, open-minded people. All it took was shining a light on the injustice. Looking back, I think the HOA had believed that most homeowners would never question their authority. They got too comfortable throwing around fines and liens to enforce rules that had no solid legal foundation. By taking a stand, I forced them to reckon with their own limitations. It was a lesson for everyone. Know your rights, don't be intimidated, and be willing to stand up for yourself when you know the law is on your side. Life returned to normal. The battle over my pool became a memory, albeit a vivid one. On hot afternoons, I'd float in the water, staring up at the sky, feeling the warm sun on my face, no longer worried about who might be peeking over the fence with a camera or concocting nonsensical rules. Occasionally, I'd think about the absurd reasons they tried to cite, aesthetic harmony and historical charters, and I'd laugh. The whole situation was as surreal as it was revealing. Over time, the story of my pool battle took on a kind of local myth status. People referred to it jokingly as the Pool War. Some newcomers to the neighborhood heard about it and asked me about the details. I'd shrug and say, "It's all settled now." The important thing was that the HOA's old guard had learned that they couldn't push people around indefinitely. They tried to enforce a rule that didn't exist, on a property they didn't govern, and they paid the price. I suppose the final moral of this experience is that community organizations serve the people, not the other way around. If an HOA tries to control you without justification, don't assume they have the right. Do your homework, consult experts, and stand your ground. Because if you let someone else define your rights, you might find yourself forbidden from using your own pool for no good reason at all. I, for one, can't imagine letting that slide. As I sit here now, typing this out after a quiet afternoon swim, I feel at peace. The neighborhood is calm, fair, and friendlier than ever. My pool sparkles under the sunlight, undisturbed, and I know that I've done my part to keep it that way. Friends, thank you. See you soon.